The first time I noticed her, it was during a casual evening at my friend's house. I had come over to drop off a project we'd been collaborating on, expecting the usual banter and laughter with my friend. But the moment I stepped into the kitchen, she was there, my friend's mom, moving through the room with a quiet grace that somehow made the ordinary space feel warmer, softer. She was in her early 40s, effortlessly elegant, with an easy confidence that didn't demand attention but naturally drew it. Her smile when she saw me caught me off guard. Not a polite, fleeting smile, but one that lingered just long enough to make me feel like I had stumbled into a secret she wasn't yet ready to share. The way she tilted her head slightly, the subtle glint of amusement in her eyes, made it impossible for me to look away. Even the small things mattered. The faint scent of her perfume, a delicate mix of jasmine and vanilla that seemed to hang in the air, the gentle sway of her movements as she reached for a mug, and the way her fingers brushed the countertop with care. I was aware of every detail, every subtle motion, because my attention refused to wander. When my hand accidentally brushed hers while reaching for coffee mug, there was a flicker of something electric, though we both pulled back quickly, almost embarrassed. Yet in that brief contact, something unspoken passed between us. A quiet acknowledgement, a small recognition that we were noticing each other in a way that was beyond polite acquaintance. We spoke, as one does when meeting someone in a familiar space, but every word she said carried a warmth that made even ordinary conversation feel intimate. Her voice was soft, measured, but with a tone that suggested she had lived enough to understand the weight of words. She asked about my studies, my work, my life, and listened in a way that made me feel seen, really seen. And I, in turn, found myself opening up more than I expected, drawn not just to her kindness, but to the subtle wisdom in her expressions, the quiet strength she carried effortlessly. Throughout the evening, I noticed how she moved, the small gestures that spoke volumes. A hand resting lightly on the edge of a chair, a brush of hair tucked behind her ear, the way she laughed at my jokes without forcing it. These tiny details, almost imperceptible, made my pulse quicken and my thoughts wander. There was a gentle magnetic pull, something tender and unexpected, forming between us, though neither of us said it aloud. By the time I left that night, I was carrying more than just my bag. I was carrying a quiet fascination, an awareness of a connection that felt unusual, significant, and utterly forbidden in its subtlety. Even now, thinking back, I realize it was the first time I truly noticed her. The first time I realized that my friend's mom, with that lingering smile, had quietly shifted the rhythm of my world. It happened a few days later when my friend had gone out for a few hours, leaving me alone with her in the house. I wasn't sure why, but the thought of being in her presence without anyone else around made the air feel heavier, warmer somehow. We started with something mundane, organizing the living room, picking up a few scattered items, sorting through books. But the normalcy of the task only made the subtle tension between us more palpable. She moved around the room with the same effortless grace I had noticed before. Every motion seemed deliberate, though natural. The tilt of her head as she examined a book, the way her fingers lingered on the edge of a shelf, or the soft rustle of her blouse as she reached for a cushion. And I noticed things I hadn't before. The warmth of her presence, the quiet confidence in how she carried herself, and the almost imperceptible smile she wore when she caught me watching her. We fell into conversation easily, though there was an unspoken layer beneath every word. She asked about my work, my studies, my life, but it wasn't just casual curiosity. It felt intentional, a quiet probing that made me feel both seen and understood. There was a gentleness in her tone, a softness that contrasted with the sharp precision of her gestures. I realized that in this quiet space, away from the eyes of others, there was freedom. Freedom to notice the way her hair fell across her shoulder, the faint warmth of her hand brushing against mine when she handed me a book, and the brief, lingering glances that neither of us quite acknowledged. At one point, She bent down to pick up something I had dropped. Our hands touched accidentally, and I felt that same spark from before, an electric awareness that sent a warmth up my arm. I looked at her, and for a moment, our eyes met in a way that made me catch my breath. She smiled, almost shyly, but there was a depth to it, a quiet understanding that this touch was more than casual. We continued talking, and somehow the world outside faded. The ticking of the clock, the distant hum of traffic, even the faint rustle of leaves outside the window, it all became background noise to the subtle symphony between us. I noticed the little things, the curve of her smile when she laughed softly, the way her eyes lingered on mine for a heartbeat longer than necessary, and the faint scent of her perfume that seemed to envelop me whenever I leaned in to hand her something. By the time my friend returned, I felt a strange mixture of calm and longing. There was a new layer to our connection now, quiet, private, and charged with an unspoken understanding. I left that evening aware of something shifting between us, though neither of us had said it aloud. There was a tension, yes, but also a warmth, a sense that in these small, ordinary moments, something profound was beginning to take root. It was one of those quiet evenings that felt suspended in time. My friend had gone out again, leaving me alone with her in the soft glow of the living room lamps. The house was hushed, filled only with the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the distant rustle of leaves outside. She was sitting on the couch, a book resting in her lap, but she wasn't reading. She was watching me, and there was a subtle shift in her expression that made my chest tighten. Curiosity, hesitance, and something deeper I couldn't quite name. I had been organizing some papers nearby, but the normal rhythm of the evening had changed. The silence between us was no longer just quiet. It was expectant, charged with a tension I couldn't ignore. She finally spoke, her voice soft but deliberate. "Can I tell you something?" she asked, almost as if she had been rehearsing the words in her mind for hours. I nodded, my heart beating a little faster. "Of course," I said, trying to keep my tone casual, though the warmth in my chest was impossible to hide. She shifted slightly, tucking her legs beneath her and leaning a little closer, though just enough to make the air between us feel intimate. "It's something personal," she began, her fingers twisting the edge of her book nervously. "Something I haven't shared with anyone in a long time." I felt a rush of anticipation, a quiet ache of privilege. She was choosing to confide in me, and that alone made the world shrink around us. I moved a little closer, careful not to crowd her, letting my presence be steady and reassuring. Her hand hovered near mine for a moment, almost brushing it, but she pulled it back quickly, leaving only the echo of warmth. She spoke then of a regret she had carried for years, something small yet deeply human, a choice she had made that she wished she could undo, a fleeting failure that had left her feeling vulnerable. Her voice quivered only slightly, a subtle tremor that made my chest tighten. I listened intently, absorbing every word, every pause, every sigh. There was no judgment in my gaze, only understanding, and I could feel her shoulders relaxing as she spoke. Then, almost shyly, she looked at me and whispered, "Promise me, you'll tell no one." The words were simple, but the gravity behind them pressed against my chest like a physical weight. Her eyes searched mine, and I realized she wasn't just asking for secrecy. She was asking for trust, for connection, for validation that someone truly understood her. I nodded, words failing me. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was intimate, heavy with the unspoken acknowledgement that something between us had shifted. My hand lingered near hers, almost instinctively, and I could feel the quiet electricity of being chosen, of being let in. In that moment, I understood that this wasn't just a conversation. It was the beginning of something, a bond rooted in trust, tenderness, and the subtle pull of unspoken attraction. And as she smiled, a little sheepishly but with genuine relief, I realized that the quiet evenings, the small gestures, and the fleeting touches were no longer ordinary. They were the threads weaving an intimacy that neither of us had fully named yet, but that was growing stronger with every heartbeat. The days that followed felt different. Every visit to her home carried a quiet anticipation, a subtle thrill I hadn't expected. One afternoon, my friend had gone out for a soccer match, leaving us alone again. This time, the atmosphere felt lighter, playful even, as though the house itself knew that something unspoken was beginning to bloom between us. We found ourselves in the kitchen, organizing shelves and cleaning up after lunch. She hummed softly as she worked, the sound warm and comforting, filling the room with a gentle rhythm. I caught myself watching her more than I should. The way she stretched to reach the top shelf, the gentle curve of her neck, and the delicate sweep of her hair across her shoulder. Each movement was casual, but every detail seemed charged with a quiet allure I couldn't ignore. She handed me a plate of utensils, and as our fingers brushed lightly, she pulled back with a teasing smile. "Careful," she said, her voice lilting. "You might drop it." There was nothing overtly flirtatious in her words, but the subtle glint in her eyes, the slight arch of her brow, made my chest tighten. I laughed, a little embarrassed at how much her attention affected me, and she shook her head, smiling softly as if she enjoyed the effect she had on me. The playful energy didn't end there. As we moved around the kitchen, she accidentally nudged my shoulder while reaching past me, and I pretended not to notice, though the warmth of her touch lingered on my arm. She laughed at something I said, and her laughter was easy and melodic, wrapping around me like sunlight through a window. There was a closeness developing, a rhythm in our interactions that felt natural yet charged with silent desire. At one point, she leaned over to reach for a spice jar on a high shelf, and I instinctively steadied her by placing a hand lightly on her back. The contact was brief, almost accidental, yet the electricity between us was undeniable. She glanced at me, eyes soft, lips curved in a smile that held both amusement and something unspoken, a question, perhaps, or an acknowledgement of the tension simmering between us. Even in the mundane moments, our unspoken connection deepened. Every brush of her hand, every shared glance, every playful tease carried layers of meaning we didn't need to articulate. There was a growing comfort in our closeness, a quiet intimacy that made ordinary tasks feel extraordinary. By the time my friend returned home, I was acutely aware of how much these small interactions had shifted the dynamic between us. There was a subtle thrill in being near her, in sharing these playful moments that seemed to dance on the edge of something more. The tension was no longer merely an undercurrent. It had become a pulse, steady and insistent, weaving through every smile, every touch, and every glance. In that quiet afternoon, I realized that the slow burn attraction wasn't just about desire. It was about connection, trust, and the fragile joy of shared moments that made the world outside fade away, if only for a little while. And I found myself looking forward to the next time we'd be alone together, wondering what small, fleeting gestures would pull us even closer. It was late evening when it happened. One of those quiet, ordinary moments that suddenly feels extraordinary in hindsight. My friend had gone out for a few hours again, leaving me alone with her in the dimly lit living room. The golden glow of the lamps cast soft shadows across the room, and the gentle hum of the city outside filtered through the open window, carrying the faint scent of rain on asphalt. We were tidying up some clutter near the entrance when our hands brushed again, but this time it lingered longer than before. I felt the warmth of her palm press against mine for a heartbeat that stretched into an eternity. It wasn't accidental. I could sense the intention, subtle but undeniable. Her eyes met mine, searching, holding, almost daring me to acknowledge the unspoken current between us. My chest tightened, and for a moment, I was acutely aware of the rhythm of my own heartbeat echoing in the silence around us. She smiled softly, a private, almost mischievous curve of her lips that seemed to say everything without words. There was no urgency in her gesture, no rush, just a slow, deliberate closeness that made the air between us feel charged. I didn't pull away, even as my mind raced with a mixture of exhilaration and hesitation. The warmth of her hand seemed to seep into my skin, carrying with it the quiet intimacy of shared trust and unspoken desire. The room was filled with subtle sensory details I couldn't ignore. The faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air, the gentle rustle of her blouse as she shifted slightly closer, the distant hum of traffic blending with the soft creak of the wooden floor beneath our feet. Every detail amplified the tension, making me hyper-aware of her presence and the unspoken connection that had grown between us over days of quiet moments and lingering glances. She laughed softly at something I said, the sound low and warm, and I felt a shiver of awareness pass through me. Her gaze softened, lingering on mine in a way that made words unnecessary. There was a hesitation in the way she leaned just slightly closer, a delicate dance of proximity and restraint, as if both of us were testing the boundaries of what we could allow without crossing into something overt. In that single touch, I realized how far we had come, how every small gesture, every playful glance, every quiet conversation had been leading to this moment. It wasn't just attraction. It was a deepening connection, an understanding that the bond between us was layered with trust, care, and a tender longing neither of us had yet named. As the evening wore on, we moved back to the couch, sitting close enough that our knees brushed lightly. The warmth of her presence enveloped me, and though no words were exchanged, the lingering touch of her hand remained vivid in my memory. I felt a profound mixture of exhilaration and restraint, the thrill of closeness, tempered by the awareness of boundaries and the respect I held for her. By the time I left, I was acutely aware of the weight of that evening. It wasn't dramatic or overt, but it was significant, a quiet, magnetic pull that had deepened the intimacy between us, a first lingering contact that spoke volumes in its silence, and a moment I would replay in my mind over and over, savoring every heartbeat, every brush of skin, every glance that lingered just a fraction too long. After that evening, everything felt different. The subtle touches, the lingering glances, and the quiet moments we shared were no longer just fleeting sparks. They had begun to settle into something heavier, more complicated. Every visit to her home carried an awareness that was both thrilling and unsettling. I couldn't ignore it, yet part of me hesitated, aware of the social boundaries, the age difference, and the delicate balance of friendship and trust that we shared with my friend. It wasn't that the attraction had become overwhelming. It was quieter than that. It was in the way she smiled when I walked into the room, the gentle brush of her hand as she handed me a cup of tea, the soft sigh she exhaled when she leaned against the counter while talking to me. Every gesture was small, ordinary even, yet they now carried weight. My mind would replay them over and over, each time noticing nuances I hadn't caught before. The warmth of her fingers, the subtle glint in her eyes, the quiet steadiness in her voice when she spoke my name. At the same time, I couldn't ignore the conflict inside me. Part of me wondered whether I was imagining things, projecting feelings where there were none. But the way her gaze lingered, the way her presence seemed to draw me in, told a different story. She, too, seemed aware of it. There were moments when her hand hovered near mine, when she laughed a little too softly, when her eyes would catch mine and hold them just a fraction too long. Then she would pull back, perhaps sensing the tension or reminding herself of the boundaries we had yet to cross. We spent one quiet evening on the couch, sitting near each other but not touching. She was reading, and I was flipping through a book I hadn't really been paying attention to, yet the air between us was heavy with unspoken words. I could feel the warmth radiating from her, subtle yet undeniable, and the faint scent of her perfume lingered like a whisper. Her knee brushed mine lightly, and we both flinched almost imperceptibly before settling into the shared, electric tension. In these moments, I realized that desire and restraint could coexist that closeness and hesitation were not mutually exclusive. My thoughts were a mixture of longing and caution, admiration and respect. She wasn't simply an older woman I was attracted to. She was a person with depth, with history, with vulnerabilities I could see now more clearly than ever. And she, too, was navigating the same maze of emotion, caught between the warmth of connection and the awareness of social expectations. By the end of the evening, we sat in comfortable silence, both aware of the intensity, yet unwilling to disturb it. It was a complicated, bittersweet tension, a reminder that what we were experiencing was rare and delicate, something that required patience, thoughtfulness, and emotional honesty. In that silence, I realized that the bond between us had become something far more profound than fleeting attraction. It was trust, it was care, it was the quiet ache of unspoken desire. It was growing stronger with every shared glance, every small touch, every lingering moment. The final evening arrived like any other, yet it carried a weight that neither of us could deny. My friend had gone out for the night, leaving us alone in the quiet house once more. The golden glow of the lamps cast soft shadows along the walls, and the faint hum of the city outside seemed to recede, leaving only the intimacy of the moment. There was no need for words at first. We moved around the living room in unspoken harmony, comfortable in each other's presence, yet acutely aware of the invisible thread that had grown taut between us over the past weeks. We found ourselves sitting close on the couch, the soft cushions enveloping us in warmth. Her eyes met mine, lingering just a little longer than necessary. It was a look full of meaning, trust, vulnerability, admiration, and a quiet desire neither of us had yet dared to name aloud. I could feel the subtle brush of her arm against mine as she adjusted the pillow beside her, and the warmth of her hand seemed to extend far beyond physical touch, settling into my chest and leaving a steady, comforting weight there. She leaned slightly toward me, enough that her cheek almost brushed against my shoulder, and I felt the heat of her presence, the familiar scent of her perfume mingling with the quiet stillness of the room. We didn't speak because there was no need. The silence between us was rich with understanding, an acknowledgement of everything that had passed. The playful touches, the lingering glances, the unspoken confessions, the small, tender moments that had brought us here. Then she whispered, almost shyly, "Promise me." Her voice was low, intimate, filled with a softness that made my heart clench. I nodded, knowing exactly what she meant, feeling the profound significance of her words. It wasn't just a promise of secrecy. It was an acknowledgement of the bond we had formed, of the quiet trust and subtle desire that had grown between us, carefully nurtured through patience and respect. Her smile, gentle and sincere, lingered as we sat together in that quiet, golden-lit room. There was a warmth in her gaze that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds, a quiet affirmation that what we shared was real, meaningful, and delicate. We didn't need to define it or name it. The understanding was already there, etched into the rhythm of our movements, the brush of our hands, and the silent language of our glances. When I finally stood to leave, we shared one last gesture, a hand lightly pressing against hers, a fleeting touch that conveyed everything we could not put into words. She held my gaze a moment longer, and I felt the quiet steadiness of her heart, the warmth of her presence, and the weight of unspoken connection. Then, with a small, knowing smile, she whispered again, "Promise me," and I walked away carrying that moment, that feeling, that bond with me. As I left her house that night, the world outside felt sharper, brighter, and strangely softer all at once. The slow-burn intimacy we had shared, built on trust, affection, playful closeness, and careful restraint, had reached a satisfying, unspoken resolution. There was longing, yes, but also warmth, respect, and the profound knowledge that our connection, however quiet, would remain etched in our hearts forever. And somehow that was enough.